Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Proud, and I'm the peacemonger. As many viewers asked me a lot about diplomacy, I've decided to serialize on video my memoir, which is called A Misfit in Moscow: How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed 2014 to 2019. You can find a link to the book in my bio. Many of you will already know that I was a member of His Majesty's diplomatic service for 24 years until the summer of 2023 when I retired, and that I served at the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. When I returned to the UK from Moscow in February 2019, after 4.5 years, I determined to write a memoir of my experience. 4.5 years at the British Embassy in Moscow, which started on the 31st of July 2014, had left me with an intense feeling that UK and wider Western foreign policy towards Russia over Ukraine had proved a catastrophic failure. A big reason for that was the departure from classic diplomacy, the need to engage with Russia on hard-nosed negotiation to reduce tensions and to resolve the underlying concerns, in their case, about NATO expansion to their western border. That departure of diplomacy, with British and European leaders still refusing to engage in negotiations with Russia, almost 4 years after the war in Ukraine started, it continues to this day. In the end, I continued my diplomatic career for another 4 years until my retirement in the summer of 2023, 17 months after the war in Ukraine started. By that time, it was clear to me that the British and other Western government response to the war in Ukraine simply repeated the failures of policy that had been locked in place since early 2014, including the policy of economic sanctions, in which I played a prominent role. 3 months after my retirement, I published a memoir of my 10 years of experience in working on Russia. And in this episode, I begin the video serialization of that book. In this introductory episode, I will provide the preface and the prologue to A Misfit in Moscow. To ensure that it is up to date, I have lightly edited the preface, though I will repeat the prologue and the remainder of the book as it remains in print to this day. I really hope that you'll find this insider information interesting and insightful, and comment or add questions in the chat, and like and subscribe to my channel as I continue to grow this community of peacemongers. Thank you so much for supporting my work so far. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you all very, very much peace. A Misfit in Moscow: How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed 2014 to 2019 by Ian Proud. The preface. Since the Cold War, Russia has held an unshakable and outsized power to strike fear and trembling into the hearts of Western citizens. Staring at a map, we marvel at the enormity of a country which stretches from Norway to Japan. We ponder its seemingly bottomless reserves of every natural resource on the planet, then dwell on its oligarchs with their football clubs, Belgravian mansions, and supermodel mistresses. Anxiety rising in our throats, our attention shifts to the sturdy, intimidating walls of the Kremlin in Moscow. Inside, like a 70s Thunderbird villain, an embittered Putin with a dodgy accent and a red star on his hat plots the downfall of the detested collective West. He signs off every despicable act of his massive intelligence and security empire. His grub-like finger hovers over a giant button that in an instant might launch 6,000 nuclear missiles in our direction. Western media and social media reinforce these and other urban myths about Putin on a daily basis. He'll likely die at any moment from a terrible illness and is having his final psychotic hurrah. His support in Russia is evaporating fast, but he'll terrorize his citizens until he's got the job done. Once he's finished in Ukraine, we'll see Russian tanks in Estonia. World War III will happen in 5 years, possibly three, maybe one, perhaps even next week. Although, hang on a minute, Putin's army will run out of precious ammunition stocks by Tuesday tea time. Aren't they refitting their tanks with spare parts from washing machines? And hold on, isn't Russia's economy about to implode? Everything we witness today through the lens of a heartless war in Ukraine, therefore, makes sense to us, even if we've never met a Russian person or visited their country. We believe that Putin was always going to do this. We've heard he has a bigger and more dastardly plan. So every like-minded country must spend more on defence to stop the Bearzilla. We need more NATO, not less. And whatever we do, never talk to the odious Slavic other that is Putin, because that will make him stronger and he'll just hate us more. If we keep doing what we've been doing for the past 10 years, then eventually Putin will be gone and we can usher in a new era of peace. But having studied Putin and Russia for 13 years, I take a different view. I watched Putin shaking hands with David Cameron on the lawn of Lochern at the G8 summit in 2013, at a time when UK-Russia relations were going through a periodic thaw. I served at the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 through to early 2019. I endured the low point of the Salisbury nerve agent attack and the loss of almost 80 colleagues from the embassy in the subsequent diplomatic fallout. I kept the understaffed embassy afloat through the FIFA World Cup of 2018 and until reinforcements trickled in at the end of that year. Since my return to London, among other things, I authorised a significant proportion of all the sanctions placed on Russian citizens, including since the outbreak of war in February 2022. So I've done my bit to maintain a UK foreign policy towards Russia that has been practically unchanged for a decade. I've had my run-ins with Russian intelligence agencies on the streets of Moscow and other Russian cities. I'm not a corduroy-wearing pacifist who thinks, perhaps, that Putin wasn't cuddled enough as a child and that we maybe need to be kinder to him. I was shocked by the onset of the war in Ukraine and the conflict since 2014 that has killed thousands of innocent civilians, including and especially children. I call for all those responsible for war crimes and other crimes against humanity on both sides of the conflict to face justice. But it has become a self-perpetuating mistake to expect Russia to bear all of the responsibility for what has happened. Because for anyone who studies Russia, it's clear that they blame the West, including for the encroachment of NATO to their border, which Putin has been warning against for approaching 20 years. And they haven't been heard, or at least that's how they see it. I'm a realist, and not talking to Russia is and has always been an unrealistic and loser strategy. I believe the core purpose of diplomacy and indeed statesmanship is to manage relationships between states, to prevent conflict. British and European leaders have embarked on the utmost folly in believing that we could resolve our disputes with Russia through isolation and cancellation. Diplomacy isn't about only talking to your friends. Diplomacy is especially vital in talking with those leaders with whom you most disagree. All of the airheaded leaders of Europe don't have to like Putin, that is irrelevant. Our primary goal should have been right from the start to end the war, not try to fix Russia or make Putin say sorry, because that will never happen, because he blames us. So I ask myself how we've ended up with a full-scale war in Europe for the first time in almost 30 years. Over the past 12 years, I've watched as UK ministers were so consumed by Cold War zeitgeist that they could not take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Russia is undoubtedly still a powerful country, but NATO is many multiples larger economically and is committed to collective security. Putin isn't and hasn't ever been bent on conquering Europe nor the recreation of the Soviet Union. To its underpopulated east, Russia is also vastly overmatched by China, almost 10 times larger economically. Russia's historical fear of invasion is very real in the corridors of power in Moscow, and we have forgotten that to Ukraine's peril. As I left King Charles Street for the final time at the end of a 24-year career in His Majesty's diplomatic service, I paused to look at a digital display of the Foreign Office's priorities. Bearded and grimacing, James Cleverly, Britain's then seventh of now 10 Foreign Secretaries since 2014, stared out at me as if to emphasize the importance of our mission. And I saw that the top UK foreign policy priority was to deter Russia and support Ukraine. Makes sense, you might think. We should support Ukraine. But then I asked myself, deter Russia from what? We didn't deter Russia in 2022 or indeed in 2014. One-fifth of Ukraine is occupied by a Russian army that appears content to wage an attritional war that depletes Ukrainian supplies at a time when Western military aid is dwindling and Europe is deindustrializing. Despite tidal waves of upbeat commentary in the press and from politicians, it has always been blindingly obvious that Ukraine does not have the economic or military clout to inflict a decisive defeat on Russia without direct military involvement, which has never been remotely likely. And we know that despite doomsday predictions of a Russian economic meltdown, it has the resources to keep fighting, and Europe increasingly does not. For Ukraine is bankrupt and fights entirely at our expense on our credit. So, what then of our deterrence? Even if you didn't think Ukrainian membership of NATO was a core strategic threat to Russia before, you might be wondering now. The UK, together with the US and increasingly the Europeans, has refused to acknowledge or try substantively to address Russia's concerns over the past decade. Because of this, I've watched as inescapable sanctions and megaphone diplomacy made Putin more hostile and more emboldened to take a stand, with the tragic consequences we see today. It is pure fantasy to believe that the UK has deterred Russia in the past or can in the future. And despite all the advantages being stacked against Putin, global isolation, flight bans, ICC indictments, and even exclusion from the Eurovision Song Contest, he has one trump card, his sovereign ability to decide Russia's unilateral response. In the grand game of chess between Russia and the much more powerful NATO, Putin sits across from a team of 32 players and the unelected captain, arguing loudly for weeks before each move, with a disenfranchised Ukrainian criticizing them if they don't move the pieces he wants. And it all comes down to this. Despite our collective strength in the West, our innate multilateralism means we will never be quick enough to outsmart Putin. We clearly don't want to send our troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. Unable to outsmart Putin and unwilling to fight, we should, for the first time in a decade, push for a ceasefire and support Ukraine in negotiating a just peace. Not talking to Putin and hoping he'll eventually die from a mysterious and unspeakable illness is not a strategy. And the longer the guns not butter uniparty in Westminster encourages the war to continue, pumping billions of pounds worth of weapons into Ukraine that could be better spent on hospitals and schools in Britain, the less safe Britain becomes. Working at the British Embassy in Russia must be the toughest overseas gig for a member of His Majesty's diplomatic service. You are followed constantly and very occasionally harassed by Russian intelligence. You have to deal with an oppressive security culture inside the embassy, with a security officer watching the Brits just as much as they watch the Russian staff. Colleagues are kicked out of the embassy at a moment's notice for all manner of transgressions and compromising situations. Throughout, a constantly changing cast of prime ministers and ministers flip-flop on policy while studiously refusing to talk to their Russian counterparts. At an executive level, the Foreign Office has been paralysed since the 2020 merger and drifts without a rudder or a compass. There remain some truly brilliant and decent diplomats and development experts in the FCDO, although they are, I'm sad to say, a dying breed. A 2-decade disinvestment in skills at the Foreign Office means that often we send inexperienced officers to work overseas, singularly unprepared to be diplomats. But having said all that, would I recommend a career in diplomacy? Hell yeah. You can travel the world, meet people of all nationalities, cultures, and religions, and work on issues that really, really matter. Plus, you can work with some of the most talented, passionate, committed, and just plain nice British and country based colleagues that you could ever hope to meet. And it doesn't matter if you didn't go to Eton or have rich parents. I was constantly amazed by the number of people who immediately assumed that I met both criteria. You must be that person who's relentlessly curious to understand better the rich diversity of our global community in the interests of advancing greater mutual understanding, and you got it, world peace. I worry, though, that very few British diplomats understand that basic principle these days. This is not an academic book or a forensic picking apart of the UK's activity in Russia. The limitations of the Official Secrets Act and the Radcliffe rules would prevent that. I wrote this account entirely from memory and from open source research when I needed to check specific details or data. While this is principally a book about British diplomacy in Russia, I've woven in a small number of flashbacks to personal experiences that may help readers understand why I think the way that I do. While I was careful to draft a book that would not unstitch the straitjacket of British government censorship, I cleared my manuscript through the Cabinet Office in the usual way and agreed to cut 4,000 words from the text. There are some passages where I consider the scalpel of censorship cut too deeply, and I've indicated these. However, my intention was foremost to express an opinion and not share secrets that would compromise British interests. I also wanted to write a memoir that anyone could pick up and read, who understand what it's really like to be a British diplomat in Russia, and suggest, with the greatest of respect, that UK foreign policy there has failed. For this is my story, a bullied working class kid from Southampton who became the misfit in Moscow. Prologue. Moscow, 17th of March, 2018. In the rearview mirror, I watched the Volkswagen Touareg pull away from the curb. Two men in woolly hats glared at me from the front seats. They looked like hoods from a dodgy heist movie. But the knot in my stomach told me they were agents of Russia's domestic intelligence service, the FSB, the Federalnaya Sluzhba Bezopasnosti. Part successor to the Soviet KGB, the FSB has a similar role to MI5 in the UK, but with added responsibilities for border control. They are also alleged to have their grubby mitts in all manner of illicit activities such as arms smuggling, pimping, and money laundering. Surveillance is a dull and unprofitable part of their day job. But today was anything but dull. My alert level clicked to amber as I pulled onto the Garden Ring, a 16-lane, 10-mile loop of concrete and tarmac around the heart of Moscow. There was no point trying to get away from them. It wasn't just that at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, the enormous highway was almost empty. Where would I go? They knew where I lived. And anyway, I had my wife and our kids in the car. One diplomat who tried to shake off an FSB tail car got home to his apartment a few days later to find a turd in the middle of his bed. It was a calling card that gave off the stinking message: "Don't fuck us around again." I sat in the middle lane and stuck to the speed limit. With the adrenaline pumping, my world slowed, and I was alive to everything in my direct and peripheral vision. The Volkswagen was never more than 2 cars behind. As a senior British diplomat, I was used to the unwanted advances of Russian intelligence agencies after almost 4 years in Moscow. But this day was different. It was Saturday, the 17th of March, 2018. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was about to announce the expulsion of an unknown number of diplomats from the British embassy. Laurie Bristow, Her Majesty's then ambassador to Russia, had been summoned at noon to be given the list of those people barred from Russia for at least 5 years. Our kids hummed along to Russian pop songs in the back seat, blissfully unaware. 13 days earlier, a former Russian intelligence officer had collapsed in Salisbury city centre with his daughter, who was visiting him from Russia. Sergei and Yulia Skripal were clinging to life in hospital. Tests by the UK Chemical Warfare Laboratory in Porton Down had confirmed that they were poisoned by a military-grade nerve agent called Novichok, produced in Russia during the Soviet period. Whoever had delivered the nerve agent had intended it to kill the Skripals, and it seemed likely that they would succeed. No one else in the centre of Salisbury had suffered the same catastrophic symptoms, although a Wiltshire police detective would later fall seriously ill after he visited Sergei Skripal's home. In the British Embassy and in the corridors of Whitehall, there were huge questions about who'd done this. I didn't assume the Russian state had tried to assassinate the Skripals, but the investigation would have to explore that avenue. History is littered with spectacular statement killings, signed off or supported by the Russians. Trotsky succumbed to a blotched bludgeoning by an ice axe in Mexico in 1940 on the orders of Stalin. Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov was killed in 1978 in London after a ricin pellet was fired into his leg from an umbrella supplied by the KGB. The UK was still arguing with the Russian state about how a former FSB officer, Alexander Litvinenko, had been given nuclear tea in a London hotel, leading to a slow and painful death. There is a casebook of unsolved investigations into the mysterious and often grisly deaths of Russian residents of the UK. And there's a chilling pattern in the choice of new and more horrendous techniques for killing so-called traitors. Death to traitors sits at the farthest end of the Russian punishment spectrum from a shit on the bed for a minor offence. In 2010, Putin famously said on TV that traitors would kick the bucket and choke on the pieces of silver paid them by foreign intelligence agencies. But would a senior figure in the Kremlin have authorized the use of a military nerve agent on an ex-Russian spy in sleepy Salisbury during daylight hours? Russian intelligence agencies don't appear as constrained by ministerial and parliamentary oversight as their UK rivals, so it might have been a rogue state actor. Another possibility was a non-state actor, possibly from a mafia group or an agent of a different country altogether, who gained access to the nerve agent through illicit means. Corruption is still widespread in Russia. The sale of a deadly nerve agent from the Soviet era is not inconceivable. It would have been obvious to the attackers that any hint of Russian involvement would provoke a major British backlash. Looking back on the reaction of the Kremlin and other sources in Moscow, and Russia's military and intelligence apparatus, which suffered a huge fall from grace after Salisbury, I think a unit from Russian military intelligence was freelancing without proper authorization. That's just my theory. They would have done this either because they were liberally interpreting the mood of an essentially hostile Kremlin policy towards the UK, or because they were looking to derail an improvement in UK-Russia relations that had started in mid-2017. The conspiracy theories bounced all over the place in those first few hours and days, but whichever theory you believe, it would be months before the Metropolitan Police had identified the attackers. Laurie Bristow went into Russia's foreign ministry to seek an official response from Russia on the question of how a Soviet-era nerve agent had come to be used on UK soil, and while he was doing so, the Russian ambassador to London was called into the Foreign Office to be presented with the same question. The essence was that the Salisbury nerve agent attack could only have happened in one of two ways. Either an agent of the Russian state had done this, or Russia had allowed a lethal nerve agent to get into the hands of an illicit actor who had done the deed. What was Russia's assessment? Well, there was a certain logic in the question. It was a bit like asking a man, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" The Russians were never going to engage with a question for which any answer implied that they were to blame, either directly or indirectly. So rather than answer, the Kremlin propaganda machine leapt into action to scream indignation through every available media outlet at this so-called provocation by Foggy Albion. All windows into a sensible discussion with Russia on what had happened were slammed shut, and what little remained of Laurie's influence in Moscow disappeared in a puff of smoke. In fairness, a different ambassador may not have fared any better. The Russian state setting, with boring predictability, had been switched to deny and deflect. With a request for information being stonewalled, the British government mulled over what it should do next. It had been stung by criticism that its response to the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 was too slow and too soft. The press and the hawks in cabinet wanted a tough response, and they wanted it now. Instead, the government settled on the lowest common denominator option. In any diplomatic dispute, tit for tat's become the order of the day. On the 14th of March 2018, Prime Minister Theresa May stood at the dispatch box in Parliament and announced that the UK would expel 23 undeclared intelligence officers from the Russian embassy in London. They had 7 days to pack their bags and leave the UK. As I trundled up Leningrad Prospect at a steady 80 kilometers per hour, my mind turned over why this had happened. Why would the Kremlin sign off on an assassination attempt in the UK just a month before Russia's presidential election? It was entirely possible that some deranged strategist in the presidential administration on Staria Ploshad had conjured up the scenario of a domestic electoral boost from slotting a traitor abroad. But internationally, the Kremlin was going hell for leather to deliver a football World Cup that showcased a more open and welcoming side of Russian people to the hundreds of thousands of football fans who'd be visiting the country for the first time. Nerve agent attacks weren't great for tourist promotion. And while UK-Russia relations had been frostier than a Yakutsk winter since Russia's annexation of Crimea, there had been modest signs of improvement at the end of 2017. The press was reporting that since his appointment as Foreign Secretary in the summer of 2016, an unstoppable Boris Johnson had been blocked from reaching out to Moscow by an immovable Prime Minister, Theresa May. Well, I can tell you from inside that is absolutely true. Tory party infighting and Theresa May's hardline stance was leaving the UK increasingly isolated within the EU on Russia policy. With the Prime Minister's authority dented by an ill-timed general election, that left the Conservatives governing without an overall majority. I pressed on the need for higher levels of engagement. Slowly, Whitehall was beginning to move, and in November 2017, junior FCO Minister Sir Alan Duncan travelled to Moscow for the first ministerial visit to Russia in 2 years. He visited Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium to see preparation for the 2018 Football World Cup. He also sealed a new diplomatic visa deal between the UK and Russia after a 12-month blockage, which had left the embassy in Moscow chronically short-staffed. Shortly afterwards, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, arrived in Moscow for a visit described as pastoral, ecumenical, and political. And then, finally, in December, and at the third attempt, Boris Johnson paid the first cabinet-level visit to Russia for 5 years for talks with his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. Planning was launched for Prince William to attend the World Cup in his role as president of the Football Association, most likely to watch the Europe versus Belgium group game in Kaliningrad. After an almost 4-year perma-chill in the relationship, this was a positive tidal wave of diplomatic engagement. So, against the backdrop of a slight thawing of relations, the Kremlin did it thesis didn't completely add up to me, although I didn't discount Russian state involvement in some way. In the 4 days since Theresa May's announcement, I had swung on a regular basis between a conviction that I would be kicked out and a belief that I would not be declared persona non grata. On the one hand, as the economic counsellor at the embassy, I was responsible for advising London about sanctions against Russia, specifically how they were working and where to focus next. On the other hand, I was the most dovish diplomat at the British Embassy, constantly traveling around Russia's regions, using my Russian language skills, building contacts wherever I could. I believe then, and I believe now, especially against the backdrop of today's full blown war in Ukraine, 4 years in, that the UK must engage with Russia. But that position is the antithesis of the uniparty foreign policy establishment that still insists, even today, that direct engagement with Russia shows weakness. My views also put me at odds with political colleagues who rarely left the embassy building, let alone Moscow, and accepted the hardline UK policy without question. However, it was far from clear that my dovishness would sway the cold calculations of the counterintelligence analysts at the FSB in Lubyanka who drew up the shit list. Whatever happened, I just wanted the uncertainty to end. Stay or go. I knew the next card in the biggest tit for tat expulsion of Russian and British diplomats for 33 years was about to be played. Ben McIntyre's A Spy and the Traitor recalls how in 1985, KGB Colonel Oleg Gordievsky had been smuggled across the Finnish border from the Soviet Union in the boot of an MI6 officer's car. He'd been spying for Britain for over 10 years and was forced to defect after his cover was blown, ironically, through the actions of Aldrich Ames at the CIA, who was himself a Soviet spy. The Soviet Union responded by expelling 25 British diplomats, including the MI6 officers who had smuggled Gordievsky out. And the UK reciprocated in kind. On this occasion, the UK had fired the first salvo of diplomatic expulsions. But the process was the same. You kick out ours, we'll kick out yours, and let's call it all even. It was a sunny March morning, and the snow had started its slow retreat from the streets of Moscow. I glanced across and watched the tail car carry on up the road as I pulled into the kids' school in the north of Moscow. We enjoyed our weekend routine of taking the kids for swimming lessons at the school. Sod it, I thought. Life had to continue as normal, so we'd just go. If I had to receive bad news, I'd sooner do something nice beforehand rather than stew at home. I'd rush back to the embassy after swimming class. Then, travelling back from the school, there was no hotel car. I dropped the family at home, then took the short drive to the embassy. All the British diplomats and many spouses were milling around. It was like the end of an episode of the Great British Bake Off, with contestants waiting to hear whether they'd been kicked out of the tent that week. Oh, I hope it isn't you, one would say to another. You don't deserve to go. You've been so amazing, babes, another would say, secretly praying that they themselves wouldn't have to miss Biscuit Week. Laurie Bristow was still at the sandstone monstrosity that serves as the Russian Foreign Ministry building. The least beautiful, but possibly most imposing of the Seven Sisters, statement buildings constructed in the early 1950s to please the ailing Stalin. People asking nervously when the ambassador would be back. I could see a heavy cloud of fear descending, so I went up to my office for a more productive distraction. As I locked my phone, Bluetooth headphones, and car keys outside the chancery, my mind mulled over the various what next scenarios. I never thought the Russians would close the British embassy and break off diplomatic relations altogether, just because the UK had kicked out 23 of their spooks. But just in case they did, and even before Theresa May had stood up to make her announcement to Parliament, a mass shredding of classified documents had started. We had a lot of documents in Chancery, and if the embassy had to shut up shop at a moment's notice, we wanted to go with our heads held high and avoid the unedifying prospect of a document bonfire on the embassy terrace. So I gathered up a stack of papers from my desk and walked them along the corridor to the industrial shredder, which vibrated as each document disappeared into its mechanical mouth. As the shredder ate my papers, I wondered how I'd feel to be expelled. I'd enjoyed 4 years in Russia, and it would have been disappointing to miss the World Cup. But my posting was due to finish in July 2018 anyway, so it wouldn't have been a great loss, all things told. And in truth, it was our family life in Russia that I'd enjoyed more than my life inside the Chancery. Being a lone dove in a top secret nest of hawks was hard work and made me stick out as the misfit in Moscow. There had been heated debate about how people will be told their fate. I thought it would be a bad idea to call in officers one at a time. With around 50 British diplomats in Moscow, imagine being the first person called in. Even worse, the last. I joked it might end up like the X Factor, with the ambassador playing the role of Simon Cowell. Well, the Russians have come to their decision. If I could keep everyone here at the embassy, I would. Look, there's no easy way to do this, but I have some bad news. You're staying with me in Moscow. Thankfully, Laurie agreed to my suggestion that we call in the teams to hear the news rather than individuals. Now I heard the outer door click open, anxious voice, and the movement of people. Laurie was back, and he looked pale as a sheet. Everyone wanted to get it over with, so the Chancery team, by far the largest group in the embassy, were the first to file into the meeting room. As was custom, I sat directly opposite Laurie at the large table next to my political opposite number, with a collective Chancery team arrayed on either side of us. The heavy door clunked shut. Laurie made brief remarks in which he regretted we were in this situation. He confirmed that 23 British diplomats were to be kicked out of Russia. Then he read out the list of names.